African ritual mosques for the longest time have been closed off into these specific regions, though speculation had existed connecting the mosques of ancient Egypt with the mosques of Africa proper. This gap, though, between the two made it impossible to make a true determination, considering the fact that why would they not exist in the regions in between? And in the same way, if we look at other places in Africa, like Southern Africa and Botswana and these places, why is it that we don't see these ritual mosques being utilized as big? The key lay in the places in between. Let us remind ourselves of what exactly these faces look like. They have bird faces, they have human faces, they have all kinds, but in its main thing is that these masks are used for rituals and religion and spiritualism in general. They're not just for show. Also, they're fashioned with these patterns, and some adorned or have extra pieces on them made of cowrie shells. These cowrie shells, we've already talked about how they are seen as very important in their culture. This brings me to the areas that are in between Egypt and these West African or Central African plains. In the 5th century AD, the kingdom of Makuria began to rise, absorbing previous kingdoms in the regions of Nubia, which are now in both Egypt and Sudan. This kingdom of Makuria had a place called Dongala, in which there are cathedrals, ruins of cathedrals, that still depict today their Christian past. And there used to be a strong Christian base that used to fight back against other peoples like the Muslims and all those other people. Surprisingly, this place also has some of the best and oldest Muslim settlements in Africa, not to mention their truly African history that was shining through even during the Christian period. And this is what we came to talk about. So, like I said before, you couldn't compare the African masks to almost any other mask really around the world until, of course, this came, this Christian wall art depicting some African masked men dancing, wearing African masks, and they're wearing African ritual clothing amongst Christians. It's not just that he is wearing a mask that is an obvious African construction or that it's got cowrie shells on it in this obviously similar way than to other African kingdoms, or the fact that he is in a religious and ritual dance because this is a Christian thing. It's also the way he's dressed. If you look at his shirt, it's also dotted with cowrie shells. He's got this belt thing, which you can see in Africa, it's the same. This little puffy thing that they always have right in the center of their dress. You can see this from South Africa all the way to Nigeria. And then, of course, you have the rest of the dress at the bottom. And obviously, big ears. For some reason, they always do that as well. This combination shows a continuity between regions central, or no, not central, in the center between the West African, Central African kingdoms and Egypt. There are others that will probably be uncovered in other places, but this is only one of them in this very picture alone. There's two others who are dressed like this. Here's the second figure, and as you can see, he's wearing the same clothes and he's got the same mask on with this whisk or whatever the hell it is that's coming out of his head. I assume that's a stick with a attached feather on the head. And this has one more thing that implies a deep African similarity, which of course a lot of African civilizations have. The video being displayed shows Sudanese men practicing a form of stick fighting that is identical to one practiced by Bantu practitioners. And also in that image, you can see that the man wields dual sticks. It's funny to me that when I show these similarities, someone can't explain them away. Instead, they just see it as, and then they move on. But if these people are so different, why is their culture so similar? And also, maybe you should not dismiss other evidence that comes in linguistically if they're so similar culturally. But we're not done with the sticks. The wielding of these two sticks, as you can see, does show a religious but also a strength thing since it's related to the stick fighting. And this is why pharaohs would wield these sticks that show the great power that they have over Egypt. The Narmer palette can easily show that these two were certainly used for war, or at least symbolically, and that shape that is like a sheep's crook is replacing the mace. As you see, he is holding on one hand a whip or the African fan, and on the other hand, he's holding a mace, what he used to crack the enemy's head. But also, he has something interesting on his lap. It looks like a separate fan, similar to other fans found in Africa. Now, you could easily say that that is a sword, which is fine except for a couple things. One, it's not very sword-like. It has very naturalistic forms on it. But secondly, Egyptians didn't typically use swords until the Middle Kingdom, and this is way before then. The Narmer palette is roughly from 3100 to 3300 BC. The oldest swords found in the world are in Turkey at about the same time. They wouldn't get, like I said, to Egypt for another, I don't know, 5, 6, 700 years. And even when they got there, the way they looked was pretty strange. So I think it's fair to say that's not a blade. Now, obviously, they did remove people's heads, but they did this with flint tools, which they imported from further south. And as you can see, animals seem to be worshipped as is. But to go back to the masks, there is a mask or masks found showing that people actually wore the ancient Egyptian god masks in real life. And they even had a space to talk, breathe, and all of that. So there were actually masks that were worn in real life. I think the similarities in clothing speak for themselves, literally, at least in the case of the Bantus. I know that they must as well in Sudan, considering that I showed you the book where the geometric patterns have their own life and symbolism in places as far as Ethiopia. This mixing of the traditional and Christianity has been done over and over again. As you can see in Christian Rome, Jesus and all the other Christians wore like Romans. In Christian America, they wore like Americans. In Christian Africa, they wear like Africans. Christian Asia, they wear like Asians, or something in between. Cowrie shells are not just a small thing in Africa. As you can see, this girl who is wearing these cowrie shells is clearly proud of the way she looks. And this culture, too, would be expressed in ancient Egyptian culture, especially the one that is typically similar to Nubia. And for this, I only have one word: girdle. The girdles of ancient Egypt clearly show a arc back to the history. Looking at this girdle, you can easily tell that it's 100% similar to other African girdles. But not only that, it's got cowrie shells made of gold. These cowrie shells, as you can see, they mimic the real cowrie shells. Beginning in prehistoric times, shells were used for adornment and seem to have been fertility symbols. Cowrie shells, girdles, are often seen in the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom art around the hips of nude female figurines. Scythothorianus cowries are made of thin sheets of gold. 7 are hollow and contain metal pellets that jingle. The eighth is cleverly constructed as a sliding clasp. The pellets would have made a soft sound when the wearer walked or, more likely, danced. The cowrie beads alternate with groups of small beads shaped like the seeds from an acacia tree. When strung together, they resemble the pods from these trees. The Bantu word for these cowrie shells is lumache. Now, the girdle, typical, is not used for any purpose at all. It's just a fashion statement, something typical of Africa, since in Africa, clothing was made for no reason but for fashion. Because for the most part, you're not protecting yourself against the cold. If you compare the way that people in the desert would wear, which is overdressed, some people don't understand that at night in desert it gets really, really cold. The difference is in Africa, most places, people would dress simply for fashion reasons. Looking at the comparison of the Zulu girdle versus the ancient Egyptian girdle and armlets, you can see here that the armlets and the girdle of the Zulu woman on the side match in pattern. This pattern was probably brought because different types of shells that then created this. And you can see here in the Zulu one, they've replaced the cowrie shells, which would have been the traditional way of doing it, with glass beads. As you can see there, these are all beads. And over here in Egypt, they've replaced them with other things such as gold and stuff like that. Now, of course, this one's probably not gold, given that this is a random woman. Now, this is just the Zulu. I mean, you saw there, we've got the Kingdom of Cuba. They do this with the cowrie shells. We've got Sudanese people left and right doing this. Many, many kingdoms were wearing these girdles that you will find all over Africa. So, what of the Middle East? Well, I'm afraid in the Middle East they weren't valued at all, and you'd have to go as far as India to have their value return. But as you can see, in Africa, they were just synonymous. And remember what I read last time where it said these people didn't even value gold enough to create it as a currency, but instead valued these cowrie shells, not only for their monetary value though, because they also used them for spiritual and rites of passages. There's an underlying culture that sits underneath most African cultures, including that of ancient Egypt, and it's shining through right here. Even this thing that comes out of the head of the Sudanese mosques is mimicked within the Kuba Kingdom mosques, and it also reminds me of Lower Egypt's headdress worn by the king.